series. This is our third webinar so far, and throughout we've been highlighting different institutions who have a strong grasp of research compliance and learning about how they manage it from a leadership level and how they've built it from also an infrastructure perspective. Today, I'm really excited for us to highlight clinical research billing compliance and speak with a leading Children's National Hospital to understand how they have operationalized research billing compliance practices into their program. So for today's agenda, we will provide a high-level recap of what we've spoken about so far in our series. We'll then shift into defining what we mean when we say clinical research billing compliance so that everyone is on the same level. And then we'll actually dive into speaking with Children's National Hospital to understand, where they came from, where they are today, and where they look forward to in relation to clinical research billing. We'll also leave time at the end of this webinar to allow questions from the audience. And so with that said, we have turned off the chat function for the webinar, but please direct any of your questions to the Q&A functionality. We'll also be providing a recording of the webinar after our session today. So my name is Nora Yin. I'm a manager within Huron's Research Services and your moderator for today's session. We are joined today with 3 additional panelists, and I would like to first introduce you to Mezzabeen Khan, who is a program lead within Children's National Hospital Research Revenue Cycle and Systems, which is a part of their clinical trials office. She's been with this team since their inception and oversees their coverage analysis, budget negotiation, and other clinical research billing processes. She's also currently overseeing their Cerner Powers trials implementation and eventually their Encore clinical trial management system implementation work. And to top it off, she also provides education and training to her staff in these areas. Our second panelist is Hank LaFleur, an associate within Huron's Research Services team, and he has extensive experience in developing coverage analysis, helping our clients with clinical research billing compliance, and also assisting them with planning for Encore CTMS implementation work. Our final panelist is Sarah Plager, who is also an associate within our research services team, and like Hank, also has an abundant amount of knowledge in coverage analysis, as well as budget development, and has worked with a number of clients setting up their programs. So now I'll be turning over to Hank LaFleur to kick off our session.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today for this discussion. And so if you've tuned into previous webinars in this series, you may be familiar with this slide. It's really an important place to begin our research compliance conversation because it highlights the difference between the compliance program, or the big C as we call it, and then the day-to-day operational functions, or these little c compliance functions that support adherence to institutional and federally regulated policies. So you can think of the little c as what we're going to do, and the big C is how we're going to do it. And so together they form a cohesive and a thorough compliance unit for an institution. And so today we'll be focusing on operationalizing pediatric clinical research billing. And this includes many important little c tasks that can positively impact the broader program. And so to set the stage for our conversation with Mezzabeen later on, we'd like to provide an overview of the different aspects of the clinical research billing cycle. So on this slide here, you'll see our clinical research billing process cycle. And for those of us that are working in the clinical research space, this diagram is an important reminder of the stem to stern functions necessary for a research study to be successfully carried out, even if our responsibilities may just lie with one piece of the pie. And so starting with the coverage analysis, we work our way clockwise around the wheel to study closeout. And in this process, you'll find many of these little c compliance functions. And they tie together into the broader compliance picture. And so while this is a neatly packaged process in theory, the reality is that these activities tend to sit across different departments at an institution. And so there's a strong likelihood that key compliance and financial information will be passed through investigators, research administration offices, grants offices, billing departments, and the like. And so how well this information is managed and how well these units can communicate will have a large impact on the overall effectiveness of a program. And so this also tells us the story. Can we go back to the last slide, please? Just one little bit here. So this is also telling us the story of the challenges to making changes in institutional policies and procedures, and then the practical application. So keeping in mind the cross-functional impact, it's really important that all of the key players have a seat at the table when revising components of your program. So considering all of the departments that may have a hand in this process. And so by optimizing each step of this cycle, from coverage analysis to financial recon and study closeout, an institution can start to mitigate risk and add value to its pediatric research program. And so on the next slide, we'll talk about some of those risks here. So it's important to remember that the research billing compliance environment is really dynamic, and it's critical for institutions to stay up to date on changes in billing rules and regulations. And so here you'll just see a few examples of the potential risks that an underinformed program may face. And so let's think about the coverage analysis as a good example. It's used throughout the entire clinical research cycle. So it's a good example of a little c function that can really make a difference in risk mitigation. So in order to properly develop and negotiate study budgets, correctly identify services rendered to research patients through medical coding, and then appropriately segregate charges and recover AR, an informative coverage analysis should really be developed before any other pre-award activities begin. And so while we may think of the coverage analysis as simply a determination of whether charges should be billed to a study sponsor or a third-party payer, it's really a much more comprehensive tool. So let's think about it as a tool for risk mitigation. So if a study-related charge is not properly identified and reviewed against rules and regulations at the onset of a trial, there's a chance that specific Medicare policies prohibiting billing would be missed. And so that's where these Medicare NCDs or national coverage determinations and LCDs or local coverage determinations come into play. So if the service were to be improperly billed to Medicare, this could, one, result in fines and financial paybacks, and then two, a cost to reassessing and implementing a corrective action plan at the institution to ensure this doesn't happen again. And three, it also means that a specific charge that may have been very well justified to be budgeted into the contract with the sponsor before the trial began, it means that that revenue has been lost and that money wasn't recouped where it could have been. And so you might be thinking, why would these situations that are largely applicable in the adult setting have relevance for pediatric research at my institution? And the reality is that research billing misconduct can be discovered through more than just a federal auditor. So cases of whistleblowing, for example, in the event that a staff member were to discover an issue of noncompliance and report it, do happen in the pediatric theater, and agencies are paying attention to this. So one example, one children's hospital system was responsible for about $1.5 million in double billing when a staff member filed a case that professional components for radiology services were being charged by both the hospital and the affiliate radiology practice that was reading the scans. And so after this issue was raised to hospital leaders, it was brushed aside, and this led to self-reporting to the state. And so ultimately, a large payback to Medicare, Medicaid, other carriers. And so while this is not specifically related to research, it's just an example of many of the instances of billing misconduct that can occur, and that pediatric institutions are not immune by any means. And so this also speaks to the risks of having an underdeveloped compliance program for your research. So conversely, a well-developed and informed operational functions, they can add value. And so we'll discuss some of those next. So continuing on with our coverage analysis example, you'll see some benefits here. I think the CA is a nice example here to show that it has applicability across the board. So it can increase revenue opportunities by detecting those non-covered items and services before a trial. Downstream, it's a comprehensive billing tool for departments. As sponsors are working with institutions that are putting these policies into place, there's a trust that's built that an institution is charging them appropriately and conducting the trial in a compliant fashion. So it can help build up the program, draw sponsors to the institution and the like. And so all these things considered, there are still many different institutional approaches to a coverage analysis, and then to the complexities of pediatric research. And so up next, Sarah is going to talk to us about some of those.
Thanks, Hank. We have spent some time now outlining the value of a coverage analysis, but how does that relate to a pediatric setting? A good place to begin the discussion is to discuss the federal policy institutions should follow. A common question we get is, does Medicare policy even apply if my participants are below the age of 18? Like adult care, where we recommend that you do a Medicare coverage analysis despite differences in commercial payers, we recommend that you follow a Medicare coverage analysis for pediatric institutions. While there's very limited information regarding Medicaid clinical research billing. So if you think about it, Medicaid becomes analogous to a commercial payer in this adult setting. Moreover, there's other reasons why doing a coverage analysis in a pediatric setting can be even more challenging. Conventional care guidelines such as NCCN, up-to-date, other peer-reviewed articles are rarely written in a pediatric setting. You'll find limited information, if any, regarding the recommended care for a child. Finally, and in a similar vein, drug compendiums have limited information regarding recommended off-label or on-label use for pediatric patients. Next slide. So for this reason, and because coverage analysis can be even more challenging in a pediatric setting, we have brought Children's National here today to spotlight as a leader in the field. Children's National has had a long-standing relationship with Huron, so we've been able to watch them evolve and adapt, and this includes adapting robust billing practices. Children's National is a nationally ranked program for pediatric research, and it has a world-class cellular therapy program focusing on bone marrow transplants, CAR T therapy, stem cell studies. Next slide. So as the program lead of research revenue cycle and systems, Mezzavine has quite a bit of experience in the day-to-day operations at Children's National and has led Children's National through many strategic initiatives. So for the next portion of this webinar, we want to dedicate some time to just speaking with Mezzavine to learn about the challenges, the strategies they've implemented, and just have a better understanding of their compliance program. So Mezzavine, if you can jump back on video. Perfect. So Mezzavine, thank you again for joining us today. We're so happy to have you here, and we're really excited for this discussion. To get started, could you just provide our audience with an overview of Children's National's Clinical Research Billing Compliance Program?
Sure, and thank you guys for having me. So to jump right in, at Children's National, the Clinical Research Billing Compliance Program falls under the Clinical Trials Office, which falls under the larger umbrella of the Grants and Contracts Administration and Finance. So coming from a finance office, the program goal was to ensure that the billing of research-related services is in accordance with, the informed consent form, the sponsor agreement, institutional policies, and federal and state laws and regulations. So from the very early stage, the institutional stance was that all human subject research protocols with any clinical interventions, tests, and procedures are subject to routine research billing audits. And because we're doing these audits, we need the source of truth document, and therefore the coverage analysis is the key document that we use to do our audits. Now, all our billing audits are also evaluated based on the Medicare fee-for-service improper payment error scoring and ranking. And so these rankings give us a reference point where we are with each of our studies and the risk factors. And it also establishes whether there is a systematic pattern of billing errors that we need to look into, or if we need retraining of a certain department or center or research coordinators. So that's how the compliance program is built around in children's.
That's great. And so how did you guys get to where you are today? Has this always been your current model?
So I started at Children's National 4 years ago, and at that time we did not have an established formal billing compliance program. But the need was very evident as we had, we ran into billing errors at a frequency that none of us were comfortable with. So in order to establish a billing compliance program, we realized that we need a centralized approach and not leave it to individual PIs and departments. We also know that we needed a single document that would segregate the billables, to research for standard of care and ensure that all our research documents are in congruence with each other. So therefore, we decided to go develop coverage analysis. So Children's National, in partnership with Huron, started our coverage analysis processes about 2.5 years ago. And at that time, we outsourced all our clinical coverage analysis to Huron. Now, 2.5 years ago, that's relatively new compared to the rest of our counterparts. But we have taken great strides in standardizing and centralizing our clinical research compliance program. When we started this initiative, we had hospital-wide intensive training for research coordinators, research providers, patient access team, in all aspects of research compliance billing, specifically research registration and compliance charge capture. What we found, the key was to ensure that the research versus what's routine care was segregated at patient registration level and not after the fact. And so we made sure that our coverage analysis is available hospital-wide to research coordinators, to PIs, to providers, to patient access team, so they know exactly what visit and what procedure is covered by whom.
That's great. One thing I was speaking on earlier is that, how we recommend doing a Medicare coverage analysis, even in this pediatric setting. Have you guys had any pushback with this, without considering third-party payers or Medicaid?
Pediatric settings, in a pediatric setting, not all rules are applicable. We know that. But we had leadership buy-in when we demonstrated that Medicare billing model with the modification is applicable in our setting too. And when we demonstrate to leadership that the coverage analysis not only reduced billing errors, but it also led to greater financial revenue, we really made the case that Medicare should be the basis of a coverage analysis.
Yeah, I know from working with you in the past that it was common, especially at first when we were just kind of starting out, for PIs to reach out with questions. And I think that something that Children's National has done a really good job with is just education. You've taken upon yourself to really learn coverage and, learn how to interpret coverage analysis, how to apply it. And that includes, explaining it to PIs and having them understand it. I think once they understand the rationale and the policy in place, there's less pushback. Yeah. So to better understand our audience, we have integrated some polls throughout the discussion. So this first one asks, does your institution develop a coverage analysis for pediatric clinical trials? So the different answers are yes, we use Medicare rules and regulations. Yes, we use other sources to determine routine costs. No, not yet, but considering, or I don't know.
I'm interested
We'll just give it a couple
more.
Me too. We'll just give it a couple more seconds to just see, because we still have some answers coming in. Awesome. So we have a very compliant audience here today because 70% of people say, yes, we do our coverage analysis and we use Medicare rules and regulations. So I think while there is a broad understanding of the concept of a coverage analysis, I have seen each institution have their own definition, and even how they do it is slightly different. So Mezzabine, to kick it back to you, can you give us a definition of what Children's National definition of a coverage analysis is?
Sure. So I think the best way to say this is Children's National performs a Medicare coverage analysis to its truest definition. So the first step we do is answer a series of questions that determines whether it's deemed a qualifying clinical trial or not based on CMS. And then if it is a deemed qualifying clinical trial, we will then build out the billing grid to mimic the schedule of events look through any other items that's buried in the protocol. We find oftentimes schedule of events are great, but there's a lot of information that's in the protocol. So when we do our coverage analysis, we make a thorough review of the protocol. And then finally, we'll go line by line using conventional care guidelines and NCDs and LCDs to justify our billing rationale. Now, because we are doing coverage analysis for all human subject research, should it not be a qualifying clinical trial, we will still use the Medicare rules and regulations and use our own institutional policies to complete the analysis.
Great. And do you guys develop a coverage analysis for all clinical trials at Children's National?
Yeah. So I think not just clinical trials, but clinical research, the way we define what requires a coverage analysis is that all human subject research with any clinical interventional test and procedure is subject to a billing audit, and therefore a coverage analysis is required. We took a very conservative approach just because we want to minimize and reduce our risk factors. Again, the first step we do is evaluate whether it's a deemed qualifying clinical trial. That makes it a little bit more simpler to use the Medicare coverage analysis or more answerable. And then even if it's non-qualifying clinical trial, we'll still use the same processes because we still do find that there are studies that the sponsor doesn't pay everything and it does need to go to insurance. So we will use the same NCDs and LCD rationale and reference conventional care guidelines, like you mentioned earlier, up-to-date medical journals, peer-reviewed literature, anything that's available to us.
Great. I'm glad to hear about the progress Children's National has made, but I'm sure that came with challenges and there were struggles at points. Can you speak to, what was the most challenging about adapting these robust billing practices?
Sure. So first and foremost, coverage analysis is very time-heavy and requires a very unique niche skill set. I know complex coverage analysis can take 8 to 10 hours. So you're looking at a FTE that would need to complete coverage analysis. In addition, you oftentimes can't have one FTE who just does coverage analysis all day long. So you need a team, and we found that finding an analyst is a challenge, but we also found that individuals with strong clinical and research background is key. So our analysts are research registered nurses with strong research background. The other thing is when we introduced coverage analysis, it was a cultural difference for our institution. So it also requires that the PIs have a very good understanding of billing practices. And we understand their time, and asking them to review every line item was a big ask, but we did push for that, and we needed the leadership buy-in, which we got. So that was very helpful. And when we started that, our emphasis was on education. So with every coverage analysis, when we first got from Huron, there was back and forth, so we would set up in-person meetings with the PIs to go over every line item and every rationale. And so once a PI went through the first coverage analysis, it made it a lot more easier for the following coverage analysis to come through. Also, the other challenge, like we keep mentioning, is that in a pediatric setting, Medicare rules can have conflict sometimes with the gold standards for pediatric care. So we found that to get that, we have to establish our own institutional guidelines and policies where we would have, each department or division come in and kind of complete what is considered, institutional policy so that our billing was consistent for every patient. Example would be our Cog Studies, our phase 1 oncology trials. There are some rules that are not applicable to our patient population, so we substituted our own institutional policy, just ensuring that billing is consistent throughout.
That's great. Like I mentioned earlier, I think your institution put a great emphasis on education. And from working with you, I can say that, you really exemplified this. You really took the time to understand coverage analysis. I joke around with you that you can now do coverage analysis by yourself, but you really took it upon you to learn it, to help educate others. And really, I think that by explaining it to PIs and having them a part of the discussion, they can understand it and there's less pushback. So to think back to kind of that wheel we were talking to earlier and the applicability of a coverage analysis, can you speak to how Children's National leverages and applies the coverage analysis?
Sure. So going back to the wheel, that coverage analysis kind of jumps in at every aspect of that wheel. So in every stage, you use the coverage analysis to some point. So what we do to our coverage analysis, in addition to using the medical rationale, is we also put the applicable CPT codes that is needed for each of the procedures. So when we do that, it makes it a lot more easier for our financing and budgeting team to just use those CPT codes and use the pricing, and we develop our budget right on the coverage analysis. So we use the Excel spreadsheet that our coverage analysis provides and plug in our numbers to ensure that we're not missing any procedure. This is a very specific example, but things we found that initially when we didn't do coverage analysis, we would just budget for an MRI. But as we're reading through our coverage analysis and understanding billing, we know that in our patient population, an MRI would oftentimes require sedation, which would require recovery room after time. So now we know to budget for those in addition to the MRI, because part of billing compliance is we know that the sedation and recovery room cannot be sent to insurance without an MRI. And so these are all becomes part of the research procedure. The other thing we use which we use the Huron metrics for, is understanding the complexity level of each study. So when Huron does their coverage analysis, they tell you exactly what's the complexity of a study. Now, determining a complexity level of a study actually helps with the non-billables. So this allows us to better anticipate the PI time or the research coordinator time that we need to build into our budgets.
Great. So Children's National is known for their world-class cellular therapy. You do a lot of research on these novel therapies, CAR T, stem cell, just to name a few. What are some of the biggest challenges with conducting these trials?
Right. So I think, and I think, Sarah, when we started our coverage analysis, stem cell therapy, CAR T therapy, that was the group that we got the most pushback from. So Medicare regulations lag behind the research. Our main pushback was generally from these group of investigators. So what we did is we established criteria using the vast amount of literature available, or vast enough, but not enough really, to develop institutional guidelines. We also collaborated with other institutions to understand their billing practices. Anytime we collaborate with any institution, I'm always requesting if they're willing to share their coverage analysis. It gives us the opportunity to see how other institutions are referencing. We have sometimes, had seen situations where we requested a coverage analysis and then went back to our coverage analysis team and asked them to review our coverage, a blind review of our coverage analysis, and compare to see, if we're all within our pediatric institutions, we're all using kind of similar rationale, or if we need to update our rationale. So that's how we are taking this approach for stem cell and CAR T therapy.
That's great. I think it's a really popular topic right now. And I know during our time working together, we worked hard on overcoming these challenges, and we made a lot of progress, but these are really challenging. And these studies are quite expensive. So we are now ready for our next poll. And this one touches on the utility of the coverage analysis. So this one asks, if your institution does a coverage analysis, do you use them during budget negotiation? Yes, no, I don't know, not applicable. And just a reminder, we have the Q&A open throughout the chat. We're getting some good questions in here, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to submit them. Awesome. Well, this doesn't surprise me after the previous poll. I think we have a very compliant audience with us today, and some, those that are really utilizing the coverage analysis. So 86% said that they use the coverage analysis in budget negotiation. So as we've discussed earlier in the webinar, there are a lot of downstream impacts of a coverage analysis. Clients who use a coverage analysis can recoup a lot of money for their institution. Back to you, Mezzabine. Can you speak to how Children's National uses the coverage analysis as a tool for budgeting? I know you touched on it a little bit briefly.
Yeah, we 100% use the coverage analysis. We will not go into budget negotiation without that coverage analysis. The way we approach it is we complete the coverage analysis. We will then do our internal budget based on the coverage analysis and then review the sponsor budget to see how it compares. So 100% we will go into budget negotiation using the coverage analysis.
And have you received any pushback from sponsors on leveraging Medicare rules and regulations in like a pediatric setting?
So not because of using Medicare rules and regulation, but we find that cost is the biggest pushback. And I say this is a double-edged sword. We have, we've been fortunate enough to develop a very sophisticated coverage analysis workflow that covers every aspect of a billable procedure. And that drives up the prices because now we know what to budget for. But then it comes back to our contracts teams and budget negotiation. And I know we always find a mid-ground, and then we've never really had a contract we lost because of our policies of having to use Medicare rules and regulations. Increasingly, in recent times, we are also finding that our sponsors provide their own coverage analysis, and we will have this vetted by our coverage analysis team, but we find that their determination is actually in line with Medicare rules and regulations. So I think it's becoming a good business practice overall in our research industry to use Medicare as a coverage analysis basis.
That's great to hear. So to continue around the clinical research billing cycle, let's next discuss charge segregation. How does Children's National Research Charge Review process set up? How many people manage the research charge review process?
Sure. So within the research compliance program, we have our team, a very specific team called the Clinical Trials Rev Cycle. What we found is we have two distinguished workflows for standard of care and research claims. And anything that's considered research is routed to clinical trials office. As an institution, we're also in a very exciting and hectic phase. We are implementing power trials, and we're also implementing clinical trials management systems. So in future state, with Cerner power trials, so all our human subjects, the same basis that we use to develop a coverage analysis, identify studies that need coverage analysis, which is human subjects with any sort of clinical research interventions and procedures, they will get built out in power trials, and all their patients will be enrolled on that protocol on power trials. So when we enroll a patient on power trials, this flags them as research subject, and then all research subject is placed on a manual build hold. Our office has 24 to 48 hours for inpatient versus outpatient to review both the standard of care charges as well as the research charges. And we work very closely with Rev Cycle and business operations.
Great. I think that's a really integrated process and really relates back to what Hank was mentioning earlier about how it's, it's not just these individual slices, it's really a really comprehensive process. So we have our final poll for the webinar, which now asks about monitoring for research billing compliance. So does your institution conduct annual or semi-annual audits to monitor for research billing compliance? So I'll give this one a few minutes. So we're still getting some responses in, so we'll just give it a couple more seconds. Interesting. So this one we see about 50% say yes, and then 19% say no, and then 30% I don't know. Mezzabine, back to you now. Can you speak to the frequency by which Children's National performs audits and how the coverage analysis is used in this process, if it is used?
Sure. So we have audits, and also, it's very similar to audits or your reconciliations. All our studies, all our studies are scheduled out for quarterly audits or reconciliation, where we'll review the billing grid, the patient activity, review it against our coverage analysis, and compare it against our billing claims. So yeah, all our studies, we definitely audit all our studies on a quarterly basis. And then we also have, so these are our scheduled audits, and then we also have targeted audits. And usually targeted audits would come through if we, through our scheduled audits, if we find there's a consistent billing pattern or it's a systematic issue or a systematic pattern, then we will look through all those studies that are affected in these billing patterns and audit those studies. Again, depending on, and then when we audit these studies, we do evaluate them and rank them based on risk factors using the Medicare scale. And if they are ranking consistently high, then we have research coordinator training for billing that we would ask them to retake the training. We will sit down with PIs to go over it. So any study that gets a higher risk ranking obviously gets flagged, and we continue to review them at a closer, we'll keep looking at them at a closer frequency than our other studies. But yeah, we definitely audit studies.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear that. So we've got some great questions in here. So I want to thank you first, Mezzabine, for taking the time to join us today for this discussion. I think it's been really great. I think it's been informative about how Children's National has operationalized pediatric research billing. We hope this webinar has provided our audience with information you should consider when evaluating your clinical research program. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Hank, who is going to kick us off with some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Mezzabine, for all your insights today. It looks like we have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to pull up some of those now so we can address. So, Mezzabine, do your coverage analysts also prepare the study budgets? And if so, does your average 8 to 10 hours per study represent only the CA, or the average time to prepare both the CA and the budget?
Okay. So our coverage analysis only complete the coverage analysis, and then we take it back to our grants and contracts team to complete the budget. We find that the separation of duties is actually very helpful. Our finance team is great with numbers, so they focus more on numbers, and the coverage analysis team focuses on the clinical aspect. The 8 to 10 hours is specifically for a coverage analysis. That's an average for a high to exceptionally high complexity level. I think to understand that complexity levels are based on the number of arms, the number of procedures, and that's how we define what a complexity level is. So an 8 to 10 is more so for a high or exceptionally high complex study, but that number is just strictly for the coverage analysis.
Great. And so another question here, can you expand upon how you internally evaluate the complexity levels of your studies?
Yep, so we use the matrix that Huron has trained us on. So and I think, Sarah, you could jump in a little bit. It's based on the number of procedures and interventions that requires to provide rationale. In addition, the arms, something like a CAR T cell therapy is always exceptionally high. Oncology trials generally fall, oncology with consortium trials generally fall on the high level. And then we have industry sponsor, which even if they have multiple arms, because industry sponsor studies are generally willing to pay for majority of the research procedures, those would be falling under the medium, because if it's research paid, we don't always reference LCDs and NCDs because we know that the sponsor is paying for it.
Great. And so, and this may be hard to really zone in on a number here, but could you comment on approximately what percentage of your institution's patients are on clinical trials?
That is something we would probably have better answers when we have a CTMS or when we go live with Power Trials. But I do know with our oncology, at least 90% of our patients are on some sort of clinical trial.
Great. And so how do you deal with Cog studies? So where your coverage analysis determines that some procedures are sponsor paid, whereas the Cog coverage analysis that they maintain, that these are all standard of care.
So I think when it comes to Cog studies, we have institutional guidelines. We, at a very early stage, realized that some of the imaging associated with a study or a safety lab might not have an LCD or NCD, but just because of the standard of, conventional care guidelines, we know that that can be something that's coverage, and we have also tracked it based on evidence-based. We see that insurance and commercial payers, and this is where we work with RevCycle, that they are willing to pay for it. So for many of our Cog phase 1 studies, we have established that imaging or safety labs associated with specifically the treatment would be considered standard of care. Generally, when it comes to Cog studies, we do closely follow the NCT or the CTSU coverage analysis that is provided.
Great. And so in a similar vein here, so how do you make standard of care versus research determinations when, based on the design of the trial, a particular service might be routine for some subjects and not for the others, based on the type or stage of cancer or guidelines stating as medically necessary, and that the PI's position might be, I will do this outside of the trial for most of my patients, but not all?
So we take a conservative approach if we do run into situations where it's not applicable to all the patient population, or it's specifically to a certain group of patients, then we would say that's research paid, and we would negotiate that with our budget, with our contract team and our sponsors.
Great. And so a little bit back to more operations here. Do you have research coordinators that do coverage analyses, or a central location, or both?
We are very centralized, just because we found that when we leave it to individual providers or PIs, there's difference of opinions, justified so, but because there's difference, we want to ensure consistency. I think the OIG office will take more into consideration if you document and have the same billing practice, even if it's incorrect. So we have a very centralized approach. Our coverage analysis team, we work with falls under the clinical trials office, and all our coverage analysis is developed by that team.
Great. And so speaking of coverage analysis and this team, how did you bring this team up to speed on this new approach to coverage analysis? Did you hold trainings? Who's been impacted, and how did you really get this up and running?
Sure. So like I said, we're a very new group, new to this process, 2.5 years. So we've been lucky enough to have whoever we started with continue on. Having said that, our team, we found that it's a difficult position to fill, but we did look within our institution for people with very strong clinical background. So we find that research registered nurses are excellent for the position. We have continuous learning through different resources. I think Huron is one that provides training. We review institutional guidelines on a frequent basis to make sure that that's still applicable. So that's how we keep our analysts informed and trained.
Great. And so a couple more questions here. So Mezabeen, how many studies per year would you say you review? Which may again be difficult to I guess how many pass through your office?
So right now we have 300 active clinical trials. I think that's a good basis. All these clinical trials have coverage analysis that we're Within that percent, there were new studies that we completed, and then there were some ongoing studies that we went back and did coverage analysis for. And then sometimes we ran into situations where we might have to renegotiate the budget, and we did so.
And then within that portfolio, can you comment on the distribution of industry funded versus federally funded and the like?
Sure. So children's is 70-30. 70% is federal nonprofit and 30% is industry sponsored.
Great. And so looks like just one last question here. So with regard to developing the CAs, were you able to incorporate sponsor payment for development of these CAs into the budget? And so, how does Children's National cover the costs of developing these CAs?
So we are able to recoup most of the costs from industry sponsored. We've looked at study startup costs from different institutions and came up with the best midpoint, I guess, fair market value for coverage analysis. So yes, for industry sponsored, some nonprofits we do. So industry sponsored, we do charge them for coverage analysis cost. There are some nonprofits which do. Federal is a different model just because we, out of grants compliance, we don't really charge for pre-award activities. So that's a little bit different. That is covered by FNA.
Great. And so just, we touched on that Children's was, planning the implementation of CTMS. What were some of the decisions that, the reasonings for the decisions that went into selecting a system and deciding to move forward with this, rather large strategic initiative?
Yeah, so I think the main key was we find that we weren't centralized. When it's left to, tracking research activity, in the absence of the clinical trials management systems, as an institution, we have very little visibility on how many research patients are enrolled, what is our accruals, our milestones. So that was one of the primary reasons why we went with a management system, Encore specifically, is to be able to better track our research patients, centralizing that that workflow. Within our structure, research coordinators don't report up to a single person. They report to their individual PI, so there was always different levels of understanding when it came to research coordinators, and there was a disconnect. So centralizing from our clinical trials office made the most sense for our organization. Our office will build out the study protocols. We'll have the coverage analysis built out. So that's, that's a tool that's available to all the research coordinators.
Great. And so you speak of your team that's centralizing all of this. How big are your coverage analysis and your budget teams? Like how many FTEs? And then how many folks do charge review, that kind of distribution?
So our coverage analysis team is 2 people, but we also, as we talk about, we do also still partner with Huron in a lot of our coverage analysis. Our clinical trials office is a group of 4 people and 3 main and myself that review claims and oversee, the financial aspect of it. We also have counterparts, research counterparts, research individuals that are specifically assigned for research review in the rev cycle team, the hospital rev cycle team, as well as business operations team. And then we also have a CTMS coordinator.
Great. All right. So is there anything else, Sarah, Mezzabine, Nora, that y'all want to add? I think this is a really great discussion today. And oh, go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, actually, I do have a question for Mezzabine. I think, with some of our clients, what we've heard is that they sometimes can experience some, difference in language between those who understand clinical research and those who are more revenue cycle. And so can you speak to some of the tactics that you've been able to leverage to be able to mold those 2 different worlds together?
So I think, and I agree with you, Nora, there is a difference between, having that clinical expertise and financial expertise. In our institution, the way we're set up, the clinical trials office is kind of the liaison between the clinical world, the faculty, and the finance world, just because of how we're uniquely placed. What we also found that we would take people from each of the different cycles, like the rev cycle and business operation, and mainly have them focus on research. So in addition to doing their rev cycle, they're also largely involved with the clinical research portion. So I think having identified personnel in each of these departments that are more focused on research helps with that.
Great. And then do you send any of your team members to conferences or training boot camps to kind of get them up to speed? Or how do you support, I guess, the continuing education?
Sure. So we always take advantage of the many clinical research conferences that we have. All our team members have gone to the MAGI conference that I have participated in the last 3 years. There's also boot camps with our research coordinators. Sorry, with my team, even though they are in the clinical trials office, we do ask them to do the CRC training just so they have a good understanding of the research world. And then we also ask them to take clinical research billing compliance, the city training for GCP training. So there's always training that's both clinically heavy in the research world, as well as billing compliance training that's available through city.
So it looks like we have another question that just rolled in. So Mezavine, could you talk a little bit about how Children's handles coverage analysis for protocol amendments?
Sure. So when we have a protocol amendment, we do it. Obviously, all our amendments go through our IRB. Within our IRB, when there is a protocol amendment, we get triggered into it, and we will review our coverage analysis again, compared to the new protocol, and see if there are any changes to be needed. So yeah, there are often times when we will revise our coverage analysis, or sometimes have to do almost a brand new coverage analysis when there is a really big changes in the protocol.
Great. Well, this was a really great discussion today, and we appreciate your time. All of our contact info is here on the slide. If folks have questions, feel free to reach out. And if none of the panelists have anything to add, I'll turn it back over to Nora.
Actually, it looks like we just got one more question.
Oh,
yeah.
Great. This is great, guys. Keep them coming.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of amendments, sometimes protocol amendment does not always align with budget amendment. Could you talk about how you capture those?
Sure. So it's a challenge, but what we have found is that within that line, everybody has to be communicated. So when there's a protocol change or protocol amendment, IRB gets notified. IRB we are in the IRB Ancillary Review Committee, so anytime a protocol amendment comes through, our coverage analysis team gets triggered to look into that coverage analysis. And if there's any changes to the coverage analysis, when we send that coverage analysis review to the PI, we also include the grants and contracts personnel that's assigned to that study to review. So if there is a coverage analysis revision, and the grants and contracts team will review the coverage analysis to make sure that there is no budget revisions that are needed. So it's a cycle that goes through. So IRB, coverage analysis, and then the grants and contracts team. And because I think we are lucky that the clinical trials office actually sits under the grants and contracts office, so we work very closely together.
Great. Yeah, I think we've seen some where the clinical trials office might, especially in a higher education setting, are sitting under the School of Medicine, and they have that close connection with the hospital. But it's nice to hear that, you have that connection directly with the grants and contracts, because it certainly will help with the budget amendments and protocol amendments and kind of just all that general coordination.
Yeah, so my position is kind of unique to that, where I do ensure that I am kind of delegating that to the contracts team, to the PI. So I think that's where a role like this comes into play, where you're in contact with IRB, and you're in contact with the PI, and you're in contact with the grants and contracts office, the rev cycle and business operation. You really have to incorporate all these people whenever you're doing a coverage analysis and any changes. They cannot work independently or in silos.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I think we're about close to wrapping up. So I just want to thank you so much, Mezavine, for joining us today, and also to Sarah and Hank. It was a very informative session, and I'd just like to remind everyone that we will be sending the recording out, and so you'll be able to re-listen to all of Mezavine's great advice. I also just wanted to let the audience know that we do have additional Huron content coming up related to research compliance. We have our next webinar scheduled on September 28th related to regulatory compliance. And then we also will be scheduling one related to research IT security. And then if you have any interest in listening to podcasts, we also do have a podcast series available on our website, and we will also be sending out a link to where you can listen to all of that. And as always, you can go on our HuronConsultingGroup.com website to learn more about research compliance. So thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to having you join our next compliance webinar series.